Hey everyone, and welcome back to the Battle for Azeroth class review series, where we go through every class in the game for Battle for Azeroth, and I give you my opinions on them. Today we're tackling the Warlock, which is a pretty interesting one because while Destruction and Affliction, they've received tweaks and things, well, Demonology has wholesale been revamped in my view. So it's a very interesting one to cover, and this video has been sponsored by and made with the help of Icy Veins. They're the largest destination for World of Warcraft class guides, and they have just hired 26 writers for Battle for Azeroth. They're putting a tremendous amount of effort into having their class guides being good to go for the pre-patch release date, and you're going to find those linked below. They've also been a fantastic help in making this series, and of course, it's a site that I've been using for years. So a massive thank you to them, and let's just get right into the video. And we're going to start off with Demonology, because Legion, oh boy, you tried, you really did, but Legion Demonology, in my view, was the worst spec in the game. I think it sucked. Now, the idea of having an army of demons, that was cool, but you never really felt like you were that involved with things. You were just sitting there casting empowered demons. I found the rotation to be overly predictable and pretty much free from things such as high points and excitement. Suffice to say, I really wanted a revamp, and that's exactly what I got. And I don't want to spoil you, but this is one of the best turnarounds in class design that I've seen in World of Warcraft. So, we're going to start off by covering the baseline gameplay. You see, doing the usual key changes section, it wouldn't make much sense because it's pretty much just very different, so we just got to take it from the top. Now, Demonology is the ultimate horde class. It is designed around summoning in massive numbers of demons and using these demons themselves as a bit of a resource. This means that many of the Legion, like the aesthetics, the spell names, that's been kept, but the overall resultant gameplay feel is completely different. And this all starts off with resource generation. We still use soul shards, and Shadowbolt is our basic soul shard generator. Alright, so far so similar. Now, what do we do with our soul shards? Well, we cast Call Dreadstalkers on cooldown, and we put our excess soul shards into Hand of Gul'dan, which calls in a bunch of imps. So you might be thinking, this is the exact same as Legion, what the hell are you talking about? But don't worry, it gets good. So, first of all, the imps from Hand of Gul'dan, they spawn around your character. It's mostly just an aesthetic thing, but you actually notice them, so it's good for the visual feedback of the spec. But here's the twist. We have a new mechanic, and it starts off with Demon Bolt. Demon Bolt does a lot of damage, it generates 2 soul shards, but it has a very long cast time. However, we have a passive called Demonic Core. Whenever an imp runs out of energy and dies, you have a 10% chance to gain a stack of Demonic Core. Now, Demonic Core charges reduce the cast time of Demon Bolt by 100%. So basically, it feels like a Pyroblast that is like instant, and generates resources. And you can store multiple charges of the buff, which allows for bursts of really fast-paced gameplay. Now, at any time, you'll have loads of imps up, so having them die and then firing off the instant demon bolts to get a surge of soul shards, which then go right back into more Hand of Gul'dans for even more imps, is really satisfying. The spec just feels fast-paced, and it's amazing how tangible, like, say, increases in haste are when you're playing it. So yeah, it's like the more imps you summon, the more Demonic Core charges you generate, and the more of them you generate, the more soul shards, so the more imps, and basically it's a feedback loop that is really enjoyable. Now, your main cooldown is called Summon Demonic Tyrant. This summons in a big Demonic Tyrant guy, and that will extend the duration of your currently active imps by 15 seconds and increase the damage of your imps by 15%. Now, that's cool in its own right, but by extending the duration of your imps, you end up just having a stupid number of imps alive at once. And what's cool is that when that big wave of imps eventually dies, you just get a surge of Demonic Core charges, which means you just get right back into the thick of it again. Now, our AoE is also quite different. Previously, we would just sit there channeling Demon Wrath, and that would cause your demons to pulse AoE, which in my view was super boring. Instead, we have Implosion baseline. So Implosion, whenever it's used, it causes your imps to be thrown at the target and they explode for AoE damage. Of course, whenever an imp dies because of Implosion, it can trigger Demonic Core, and that's what I love about this spec. It's got a core feedback loop that is really strong and well realized. Then finally, the mana-focused gameplay of Legion is gone, and yeah, good riddance to that. So the basic point here is that while many spells have similar names and similar functions, the changes overall create like a resultant spec that feels absolutely different to the Legion one and very much for the better. Now, of course, what is effectively a new spec is going to need a reimagined talent tree. So, let's hop on over to the talents. Alright, in the 15 tier we start with Dreadlash, which causes your Dreadstalkers to gain a little bit of AoE and deal some more damage. Then Demonic Strength is a cooldown that will buff up your Felguard, which is of course your default demon. And then finally we've got Bile Scourge Bombers, which summons in a rain of little bat dudes who plummet to their deaths for AoE damage. Then we move on to 30, so that begins with Demonic Calling. Now that causes Shadow Bolt and Demon Bolt to have a 20% chance to make your next call Dreadstalkers free. Or not free, cost 1 soul shard and be instant. Now this is, it's totally some modern WoW proc randomness, but you know what, I actually think it plays quite well with the existing feedback loop of the spec. It just means you get more demons out a bit faster, especially more imps, because it's, that's allowed by the instant cast time and the reduced soul shard cost. So essentially this would be boring on its own, but because it sort of ties into the overall feedback loop of your imps and your demonic core and just the aggression and speed of the spec, it ends up being a little bit more satisfying to play with than you maybe initially would think. Then we hop on over to Power Siphon. This sacrifices up to 2 imps to instantly generate 2 charges of demonic core, which is really fun to use. And then Doom is back. So Doom is a strange dot. It does nothing for 30 seconds, but then it does a large amount of damage and generates a soul shard. But if it kills an enemy, then there's a 5% chance that a Doom Guard will spawn for 25 seconds. So it's kind of interesting because you can spread that around in an AoE scenario, and that can hopefully get you a Doom Guard for 20 seconds, which is pretty cool, I suppose. Now, the 45 tier, pretty much the same, so let's move on to 60. From the Shadows causes Call Dreadstalkers to make the target take 20% more Shadow Flame damage for 12 seconds. What does that mean? Well, your Demon Bolt does Shadow Flame damage, so it means that will hit like even more of a truck, and you want to pair these up. Then Soul Strike is just another Soul Shard generator that you can use, just that it comes from your Felguard, the actual attack. And then Summon Vile Fiend brings in a just new type of demon to fight for you for a bit. Now 75, just some more utility, very similar. 90 begins with Soul Conduit, which is the same, but it's a 15% refund rate down from 20. Inner Demons passively summons in wild imps over time with a 10% chance to summon in an additional imp that lasts for 15 seconds. Now while it's good in like a normal fight or whatever, what I've liked is that it reduces your ramp up time because you're always running around with a pack of imps around you, and that means your immediate damage is a good bit higher, and I just kind of like that. Then finally for this tier, Grimoire Felguard brings out a Felguard as a cooldown. Then onwards to 100 we've got Sacrifice Souls. It's awesome. It basically is an increase in the damage of your Shadow Bolt and Demon Bolt by 5% for every demon that you have up. Now that's often quite a lot of damage, but if you're playing that well around like Demonic Tyrants, so having a large amount of imps and maybe your Vile Fiend if you've talented into that, then this can really pump up your damage a lot and lead to a very satisfying period of burst damage. Then we move on to Demonic Consumption, and it's very different. Instead, what it does is it causes your Demonic Tyrant when summoned to absorb all of your wild imps to buff himself up. And then finally we've got Nether Portal. This opens a portal to the Nether for 20 seconds, and from it, a demon will appear for every soul shard that you spend. So if you do like a 4 soul shard Hand of Gul'dan, that will bring out 8 demons in total, which is pretty damn insane. Alright, so that's all of the talents covered, which now begs the question, what do I actually think about it? Well, Demonology has been a surprise hit for me. Why is that? Well, it's an interesting thing to think about. Really, I think that the first thing is just that building up an army of imps is really satisfying. Look, I love RTS games, so there's just something about pulling up a bunch of dudes that I find to be kind of fun, but gameplay-wise, those imps, they just fire off attacks by themselves without your input. Normally you'd think that would feel really boring, but I suppose this spec succeeds in making it feel like you're the master of the whole process. So first, the visual feedback is a lot stronger because the imps spawn near you instead of spawning in the melee stack like they did in Legion, but more importantly, it's demonic core. It's amazing how the removal of just like a few annoying mechanics and then the addition of a good one with demonic core, how that's been able to really flip this into a spec that I absolutely love playing. Demonic core just creates this feedback loop that recontextualizes everything else that you're doing in the spec. It makes just about everything feel a lot more relevant, and by understanding that they've got that mechanic and that summoning in the imps is kind of fun and putting in Demonic Tyrant, they've just done so much to make the moment-to-moment gameplay of this spec be really engaging and feel really aggressive. So overall, I think this is a tremendous spec if you enjoy like big horde, like masses of imps, that kind of gameplay. Overall, big thumbs up. Alright, well, Demonology took a while, but Destruction, well, it won't, because it follows the BFA mantra of, if it ain't broke, tweak it a bit. So let's just get right into the core changes. Now, the core of Destro is the same, but it has some heavy alterations in the talents. Insofar as baseline things go, really they've made two big changes, and I think both of them are great. So the first one is Backdraft, which is sort of baseline. So back in Legion, Backdraft was a talent that would cause Conflagrate to decrease the cast time of your next Chaos Bolt or Incinerate. Now, it's here in BFA, but it only gives you one charge of the buff, unless you talent into Flashover, which gives you the full 2 charges that you would have been used to in Legion. I honestly wish they just made the 2-charge version baseline and just used the space to make a new talent instead of Flashover, but overall I think this is a good move. Then the other one is that Havoc has had its cooldown reduced to 25 seconds from 45. That's about the same as the Arms Warrior Sweeping Strike, which basically it's a large increase in the uptime of our primary cleave mechanic. So if you put Havoc on target A and then you attack target B, well then your spell will be mirrored on both targets, which is pretty cool. Then keeping in line with Blizzard's changing up of the cooldown demons, Destro gets an enhanced Infernal. It now generates a Soul Shard fragment every 0.5 seconds, which actually gives you an impact on like how you're playing the spec in a tangible way. And then we do also benefit from the removal of the mana gameplay, which I did not like from Legion, but really to get more into it, we need to take a look at the talents. So let's kick it off with 15. So remember Backdraft, how I said that was baseline, but Conflag only generated 1 charge? Well, Flashover makes it generate 2 and do 10% more damage. I just wish they went the whole distance and made like the 2-charge version baseline, but anyway, that's what they did. We then have Eradication, which has been moved to the first tier, and as it was in Legion, it causes Chaos Bolt to increase the damage you deal to the target that it hits by 10% for 7 seconds. Then finally for this tier, Soulfire is back, and it's kind of interesting. So it has a 20-second cooldown and a 1.5-second cast, does a bunch of damage to the enemy, and it generates 4 Soul Shard fragments. Now, what's interesting is that its cooldown is reduced for every Soul Shard that you spend. So essentially using abilities in the correct order is important, and it's a higher skill cap way of playing. You'll want to pop off your Soulfire like before you start throwing out Chaos Bolts. Now it generates 4 Soul Shard fragments, which is just under a quarter of a Chaos Bolt, and that's double the fragments generated by a non-critted Incinerate. So let's move on to the 30 tier. Reverse Entropy is a bit different because the mana gameplay, of course, is dead. It's now just a haste buff on a 2.5 RPPM rate that grants 15% haste for 8 seconds. The rest of this tier is different though, with Eradication, of course, being moved to 15 and Empowered Life Tap being dead because that's just not gameplay anymore. So we've got Internal Combustion, which causes Chaos Bolt to eat up 5 seconds of your Immolate, dealing that damage instantly. Now that's it's an interesting talent. It means that casting 2 Chaos Bolts back to back requires you to have at least 10 seconds of immolation rolling on the target. So definitely it's a tighter rotation with that option. Then finally we've got Shadowburn, which has been bumped up from its old 15 tier that it used to be in Legion, and it's pretty much the same, being a Conflagration replacement that generates 3 Soul Shard fragments per cast, but operates on a charge system. Now for 45, it's the same but with some tweaked values. 60 is pretty similar. Fire and Brimstone though is a little bit different. It now causes Incinerate to hit all enemies around the target for 40% damage and generate 1 Soul Shard fragment per target hit. So it's a big increase in pace in a larger AoE situation, which allows you to go mad with the Rain of Fires. Then Inferno modifies Rain of Fire, causing it to have a 20% chance to generate a Soul Shard, and then Cataclysm is the same as it was in Legion. Now 75 is the same, but 90 is a bit different. Grimoire of Service, currently, which is a good pick in Legion, it has been replaced by an Altered Roaring Blaze. It now causes Conflag to apply a dot tick, which honestly is kind of boring. I'm not really big into that. Supremacy causes each Soul Shard spent to increase the damage of Chaos Bolt by 6% while your Infernal is active. And yeah, this talent basically is an augment to one of your main cooldowns, which itself has been augmented baseline, and it's really awesome and satisfying to use. Then Grimoire of Sacrifice does still exist, and it still lets you play a petless Warlock if you want. And then finally on the 100 tier, Wreak Havoc is gone, which makes sense because, 20-second reduction to cooldown reduction to Havoc, that's already been baked into the spec with BFA. So Channel Demon Fire is back, and it still fires bolts that the targets have been immolated. Soul Conduit is back, but as I've already covered, it's been nerfed down to a 15% refund chance from 20. So you might be wondering what's taking the place of Wreak Havoc, and the good news is Dark Soul. Yep, it's back. Dark Soul instability gives you 30% critical strike for 20 seconds. Now, this means that all of your Chaos Bolts will hit hit like an absolute truck. Do remember, Chaos Bolts do additional damage based on your crit rating, so this talent basically is enshrining the famous gameplay of pulling up your resources and unleashing the ideal Dark Soul, dishing out extremely high burst damage. And if you were to combine that with the talent that's augmenting your Infernal, then that will be a crazy amount of damage from your Chaos Bolts, which is super damn satisfying to execute. So there you go, that's what's up with the talents. Overall, I think lots of good things have been baselined, and we actually have got some excellent additions like Dark Soul and stuff like that. So overall, let's talk about opinions. Really, I think the Destruction was a strong enough spec beforehand, but it did lack a little bit for me. What Battle for Azeroth does is it helps out with the baseline by adding some nice things in. Having Backdraft be their baseline is really good. Having a shortened cooldown on Havoc is great for AoE situations. It makes them a lot more fun. Having Dark Souls back is a great addition. Then the baseline change to our Infernal is fantastic, because previously it was cool, but it wasn't really interactive. So having it increase the pace of the spec is great, especially if you're pairing it up with Dark Soul or maybe some of the other talents. So really, Destro has got gameplay that I enjoy a lot, both in single target and AoE situations. It's got a great sense of flow with Backdraft, and it's got a set of abilities, primarily Chaos Bolt, which are, they're kind of simple, but they're pretty satisfying to execute. I suppose I would probably see myself playing Destro most of the time if I was a Warlock, and the reason why is because their damage is very upfront when compared to Affliction or Demonology, which are also both great, but just they have a little bit more ramp up time. So there you go, that's what's up with Destruction. I think solid improvements to what you saw in Legion. Is it the most exciting spec in the world? No, I don't think it is, but it's a really, really solid one, I think is my overall opinion on it. Next up, the Affliction Warlock. So Affliction was quite an interesting spec for me back in Legion. Initially, I found it to be kind of dull and boring, especially in single target, but then when I played it more, the nuances of the spec and its flow became a bit more apparent, and I ended Legion enjoying the spec quite a bit when it came to doing grouped content. Eventually I was going towards it instead of Destro. Now Affliction has seen a few changes, so let's take a look. Alright, let's talk about the core changes to Affliction. So first up, Drain Soul is no longer your baseline filler, instead Shadow Bolt is. Now Drain Soul is still available as a talent, and that talent will replace Shadow Bolt, and I think this is just meant to make your damage dealt feel a little bit more direct to your character, but past that you're still dotting up targets as you would expect. Unstable Affliction though, it now causes targets to take 10% more damage, and this is essentially baking in the Contagion talent from Legion. Now the mana gameplay, like with the other Warlock specs, is dead, thankfully, with mana not being an issue, and of course life tap being removed just from the class, which overall is taking out one of the more annoying parts of Legion Warlock gameplay. Now our main cooldown has changed quite a bit, and this is in line with the broad cooldown demon direction of BFA. Of course, we no longer choose between our Doomguard and our Infernal. Now for Affliction, our main cooldown demon is Summon Dark Glare. This is actually great because it augments the class gameplay. So Dark Glare will extend the duration of your dots by 8 seconds, and Dark Glare gains 10% increased damage for every active dot that you've got. Other than that, well, the basic rotation is pretty much the same in single target and AoE, so let's hop into the gameplay explainer. Okay, so the core of Affliction, obviously, it's dots and more dots. Your basic dots are Corruption and Agony. Now, Agony is a bit different because its damage ramps up over time in the form of a stacking debuff, but then if you refresh Agony, it maintains the debuff stacks that it's got on the target. So a big priority with this spec is just maintaining Agony on the target on all times, and of course, refreshing Corruption as well. Now, our main resource is Soul Shards. Soul Shards are generated by ticks of our Agony dot. I believe it's 2.5% chance for your first tick, and then that increases for every subsequent tick, and then of course resets when you get a Soul Shard. Now it doesn't scale linearly with multi-dotting, so dotting 3 targets will not triple your Soul Shards, but of course it still will overall be a net increase, so you do want to multi-dot a lot with this spec when you can. And really, that's the core abilities. It's not a high number, so for the most part, maintain Corruption on the target, maintain Agony in the target, then you want to maintain Unstable Affliction on the target because it increases the damage that the target takes by 10%, which of course is great for the dots you've already put in the target. Then Soul Shard generation works such that doing that you'll have a slight surplus of shards, which means from time to time you can stack multiple UAs on top of each other. Now we'll talk a lot more about that whenever we cover Deathbolt and the talents, but really then just the rest of the time is just spent chucking out Shadow Bolts. Then as we hop over to AoE, well, it's kind of similar, but you can spread corruption, of course, using seed corruption. Seed corruption just, it goes on a target, that target will explode, and that explosion will spread the corruption dot to nearby enemies. So basically you're doing that, and you're just maintaining dots on multiple targets, and then spreading out the unstable afflictions across multiple targets to ideally, just attempt to amplify the damage in all of them. And really, that is the core of Affliction Warlock gameplay. Really, the only difference is that, of course, you don't have your artifact ability, but with that covered, let's move on to the talents. So as always, we're kicking it off with the 15 tier, which is a pretty major one. So Malefic Grasp, or Malefic Grasp, whatever, it's gone. Now this used to cause Drain Soul to increase the damage, done by your dots on the target. So you'd apply 2 UAs and then you'd amplify them kind of using Drain Soul. Of course, Drain Soul is no longer baseline, so this wouldn't work. And this is an area of lost gameplay, but thankfully there's a new talent that makes up for it. Death Bolt is a really awesome talent. It's on a 30-second cooldown, instant cast, and it deals 30% of the total remaining damage of all of your dots on the target immediately. So if you do this in a target with no dots, it'll do nothing. If you have just dotted up the target with fresh dots and that have a long duration, it will hit like a truck. So if chosen, this really is it takes up a major place in your gameplay rotation because it's a 30-second cooldown, which means it really is shaping the entirety of how you play your spec, which I think is really good because it means your second-to-second gameplay is always within the context of getting the best Death Bolt. Now, it also synergizes well with, say, Dark Glare, because if you put on, say, 2 UAs and then have Dark Glare extend them by 8 seconds and then get a Death Bolt in, that does insane damage. So while Malefic Grasp is gone, I think this is a really cool replacement talent. It effectively just gives you this 30-second gameplay loop that is fantastic for the spec, and this one talent for me has massively increased the amount that I enjoy playing this, at least in a single target situation. And of course, there'll be a lot of theory crafting into the specifics of how to play with it best, but for now, let's just move on to the rest of the talents. So Drain Soul is back in the 15 tier, so you can select this if you miss the old filler spell, but of course you won't have that Malefic Grasp effect to play with. But that said, it does have a really fun interaction when it comes to AoE or trash scenarios. If the target dies while it's being drained, you get a soul shard, which kind of allows you to snipe mobs that are about to die to get soul shards, which is really fun in practice. It's not something for a single target boss fight, but it's great for Mythic Plus or trash fights. And then the other talent here is Nightfall, which gives your corruption ticks a chance to proc a free instant Shadow Bolt that deals increased damage. Then the 30 tier and 45 tier are the same, just that Siphon Life has been shuffled into the 30 tier. So let's move over to 60. Now, Sow the Seeds is there, as is Phantom Singularity, and then Soul Harvest has actually been replaced with a new talent called Vile Taint. What a lovely name. So Vile Taint explodes on the target and leaves a pool of goop on the floor that damages enemies and slows them 30%. Now, 75 is the same, but there are changes for the 90 tier, and we start off with a talent called Shadow Embrace. It is a 3% damage buff that stacks up to 3 times, and it is applied by your Shadow Bolt. So with a duration of 10 seconds, you shouldn't have that much of a hard time maintaining it, especially if you went for the Nightfall talent, which of course gives you those free instant Shadow Bolt procs. Then Haunt is back. It's moved here from the 15 tier, but it operates a little bit differently, where it's on a 15-second cooldown. It increases the damage you deal to the target by 10%. So on a single target, you can have a 100% uptime of this. And then finally, Grimoire of Sacrifice is back, and it's the same. Now, 100 is oddly simple, to be honest. Soul Conduit has been nerfed. Now, of course, it's 15% Soul Shard refund chance, down from 20. Creeping Death is simple on the surface, but it does change the pace of the spec. It causes your dots to deal their full amount of damage 15% faster, which means that you will have to refresh them more often, which somewhat changes up the pace of the spec. And then finally, we've got Dark Soul Misery, which gives you 30% haste on a 2-minute cooldown. Basically, it's a personal bloodlust. Now, this is actually more relevant to Affliction because of how dots work in BFA, where the dots now calculate their tick rate based on your haste. So having an increase in haste leads to more ticks happening in the same duration, which makes this cooldown be a little bit more interesting than, say, you just cast a bit faster. As an example, because your soul shards generate based off ticks of your agony, this means you'll be generating more soul shards. So that pretty much is it for the changes to Affliction, and really, I think that Affliction is actually coming out of Legion in a pretty damn decent state. The talent overhaul has brought some really interesting new mechanics in, like, well, of course, Death Bolt, which is the star of the spec for me. for me, it brings out, like, it just brings moments of excitement into the spec, and it has a lot of depth backing it up, especially when you think about how it interacts with other talents and your main cooldown Summon Dark Glare. And then even Dark Glare on itself is really cool. It's so much more interactive as a main, like, cooldown for the spec. Now, one low point in the gameplay for me, it's gotta be Shadow Bolt. It feels a bit strange having an ability that does nothing but fill time, especially in Modern WoW. Like, I don't know, you can talent into Shadow Embrace to fix that problem, but I'm kind of left wishing that Shadow Embrace was baseline, just a part of the ability. Another idea that I had kind of, like, I enjoyed, say, amplifying your dots with Drain Soul, and I actually wouldn't mind, like, a mechanic that basically would suck the dots off your target, dealing their damage instantly. So imagine a filler spell that decreases the duration of your dots by 2 seconds, dealing that damage instantly, a little bit like the Internal Combustion talent from Destro, maybe? I mean, okay, that does sound like pretty niche gameplay, so that probably would exist as a talent, but you get what I mean there. The core point is that Shadow Bolt is a little bit boring to me, but still, I think the talents overall, they are great. There are a few builds of this spec that I really, really enjoy. AoE is still frantic and fun, and if you're down for spinning plates gameplay, which I certainly can be, then Affliction's great. Now finally, Affliction it kind of suffers from its own fantasy. It feels weak in short encounters because it has high ramp up damage, and it's got a reliance on damage over time ability. So for me, it means it can never be a main spec. I've always defaulted to running around as Destruction just in the world, but then whipping out Affliction, say for a raid boss. So yeah, that's pretty much what I think about Affliction. It definitely has a limited space in the game for me, but within that space, I really like it. And then yeah, just to round up the Warlocks, so I'm overall really happy with how Warlocks have progressed in Battle for Azeroth. Legion was a strange time for them, because like in Legion, Destruction, it was solid, but it was unexciting. It feels a bit plain to me at times, but the tweaks for it are all welcome, and they do go a long way to spicing the spec up. Demonology, it's just been transformed. From one of the worst to one of the best realized in regards to its core fantasy. So if you like the idea of summoning in loads of demons, this is a brilliant spec, and it nails like that fantasy really well. I'd say it's got a pretty good broad appeal too. And then Affliction is surprisingly great, especially with the Demon Bolt talent that really does just elevate this spec, and pulling that mechanic off to me is just so damn satisfying, especially if you combine it with Dark Glare. And then just when I mentioned Dark Glare, I think the changes to the cooldown demons are great. Each of the demons now plays a role in the spec's core mechanics, which I think is a good improvement in design, even though it does come at the loss of, say, an optional Infernal or Doomguard and getting to choose between them. So yeah, there you go. That's the Warlock. Overall, it's pretty much nothing but wins as far as I'm concerned, bar maybe losing the Dreadwind Harvester if you were, or the Deadwind Harvester if you were really into that. So yeah, that's what's up there. A massive thank you to Icy Veins for supporting this series and by sponsoring it, and also by helping me out. It's been really great being able to bounce my scripts off the class writers to get their take and stuff. So a massive thank you to them. You can check out their content down in the description below. And with that said, guys, thank you very much for watching this video. I'll be back soon with another class review, and yeah, I'll see you next time.